Okay, everyone, you've made it. Welcome to the last lecture of Endocrine and the last lecture of the semester for Bio 139. We're going to wrap up endocrine with the pancreas and some other tissues that perform some endocrine functions but are not really part of the endocrine system. After this lecture, you should begin reviewing both for Lab Exam 3 and Lecture Exam 4, which go hand in hand, but also for the final exam. We are at the end. And there's not really attendance question for this lecture. This is your chance to look back over the semester and ask yourself if you feel like you think this class provided any information that will help you in your program, and hopefully the answer to that is yes. If you feel like the answer to that is no, I strongly encourage you to let me know, because it is my job to prepare you for your program and for your career. I know this has been a difficult class. It's really uncomfortable while you're taking it. Hopefully I was able to make it enjoyable, but I understand that I can't really do that for everyone. But that difficulty, that challenge that this class gave you is to prepare you to go out there in your program and your career and excel. Hopefully I've done that. If I have not, please let me know what, from your perspective, I could have done differently so that way I can grow from it. All right, so let's get going.
So let's wrap up endocrine. Let's wrap up the semester. We have two images here. The image on the left is from page 642 of your textbook. And this image that we will come to in just a moment is on page 656 of your textbook. I believe also the two microscopic images on the right are on page 642 of your textbook, I think. If not, they are somewhere in your textbook. I thought that they were. But what we're going to be talking about for most of today is the pancreas. And that's what we see right here. And here is the duodenum, the first part of the small intestines, right as it leaves the stomach. And you can see when you look at the pancreas, it's got some ducts that empty into the duodenum. Now, the pancreas is interesting in that it is both an endocrine gland and an exocrine gland. It has both functions. So while we are mostly going to talk about the endocrine stuff, I do want to begin with the exocrine functions. It produces several digestive enzymes and bicarbonate. We mentioned how the pancreas empties bicarbonate into the duodenum to kind of get rid of that acidic action that was going on in the stomach. We talked about that back in pH. Well, the bicarbonate and other digestive enzymes are emptied into the small intestines where it mixes with the chyme that has left the stomach. It helps further digest a lot of substances that are not yet fully digested. Now, it's the acini cells that do this. If we look at the pancreas tissue under a microscope, which is what we see here, and also in the lab video, you'll see quite a bit of that. Something like 85–90%, or maybe even upwards of that, of the pancreas is exocrine. It's going to be those acini cells. And the acini cells are these darker pink structures. The acini cells make those digestive enzymes and the bicarbonate. And that is what empties into this pancreatic duct, which then drains into the duodenum. So the acini cells are the exocrine part. The digestive enzymes that the acini cells make further break down proteins. The stomach started that, but the proteins are further broken down by these digestive enzymes. Fat, starch, nucleic acids, these things that were not digested properly in the stomach continue to be digested in the small intestines thanks to the enzymes from the pancreas. And as we said back in the previous chapter, bicarbonate neutralizes the stomach acid. But mostly what we're concerned with in this chapter is the endocrine portion. So again, when we look at the microscope slide, there are some smaller, lighter staining structures. These are called the islets of Langerhans, the islets of Langerhans, or the pancreatic islets. Now, the pancreatic islets, or the islets of Langerhans, they have a few different cell types. We're going to be talking about the alpha cells and the beta cells mostly. We're also going to briefly mention the delta cells. Looking at them, if you're really good, you can pick out which ones are which. You do not have to do that for lecture and lab. You just need to know that there are alpha cells, beta cells, and delta cells here, and they all have different functions. So, first, let's talk about the beta cells. The beta cells of the islets of Langerhans, which, by the way, the islets of Langerhans, this is the endocrine portion. This is the endocrine portion of the pancreas. And the beta cells produce insulin. Insulin is an amino acid-based hormone. It's a protein. Its stimulus for release is increased blood glucose, but also increased amino acids, increased fatty acids, and stimulation by acetylcholine, ACH. Remember, acetylcholine, ACH, that's our parasympathetic nervous system. So parasympathetic nervous system releases ACH, and that stimulates insulin. It's inhibited by decreased blood glucose. So when your blood sugar drops, that decreases insulin. It inhibits the release. It's also inhibited by growth hormone. Remember when we were talking about growth hormone, we said growth hormone interferes with the action of insulin. And also sympathetic nervous system inhibits the release. Its function, there are a few. First, glucose uptake, especially at skeletal muscle and fat, but really all over the body. So most tissues in the body, now the brain does not require insulin to access glucose. The heart, for the most part, doesn't require insulin to access glucose. But most of the tissues in our body, when glucose is in your blood, it needs to be able to move into the cells. And most cells require insulin in order to bring that glucose in. Insulin stimulates your cells to make these channels that bring glucose into the cell. So glucose uptake is one function. Glycogenesis at the liver. So you may have talked about this in Bio 137 if you covered cellular respiration. In that same chapter, glycogenesis was introduced. Now, when our body has more glucose than it needs at that moment, it does not leave the body in feces or urine. What actually happens is our liver and a few other tissues will take that excess glucose in and start to string it together in these long branching chains of glucose called glycogen. The formation of glycogen, taking a whole lot of glucose and stringing it together, is called glycogenesis. And also at the brain, now we said that at the brain it's not required for glucose uptake, but it does do other things at the brain. At the brain, it plays a role in learning, memory, feeding behavior, and neural development. So at the brain, it's not required for glucose uptake. It is required for other activities in the brain. Hypersecretion of insulin leads to hypoglycemia. Now make a note of this, because when we get to our next hormone, it's going to get kind of a little bit hairy. Hypersecretion of insulin causes hypoglycemia, low blood sugar. Well, if insulin causes your cells to pull glucose out of your blood, if you have too much insulin, then you'll pull too much glucose out of your blood, and your blood glucose levels will drop. That's what hypoglycemia is. Hyposecretion is diabetes mellitus. Now, we've talked about diabetes mellitus several times by this point. This is the diabetes that you think about when you think about diabetes. Now, the symptoms of diabetes mellitus include polyuria, excess urination. Remember, that's common among all types of diabetes. Polydipsia, increased thirst. Well, if you're losing urine at a faster rate, if you're peeing a lot, you're losing water, so you're going to get thirsty. Polydipsia. Polyphagia, increased appetite. You're hungry a lot. But it could also lead to decreased hunger. So depending on certain types, you may have increased appetite, you may have decreased appetite. Central nervous system depression. Now that doesn't mean depression as in feeling sad. This is a slowing down of the central nervous system functions, and that could go as far as leading to a coma. You can have acetone breath. This ties into that diabetic ketoacidosis we've mentioned earlier in the semester. Diabetic ketoacidosis can lead to acetone breath. It's kind of like fingernail polish. It's a very chemically smell. And ketoacidosis, which we already mentioned. Now, when we talk about diabetes mellitus, there are two types. Type 1 is genetic or autoimmune. Maybe you inherited this, and in an autoimmune disorder, this is the islets of Langerhans are seen as foreign by your immune system. They start attacking the islets, and you can no longer make insulin. So insulin is not even being made by your body. Here, this is treated typically by insulin injections. Type 2 diabetes mellitus, this is a lifestyle disorder. This is due to poor diet. Cells become resistant to insulin. We talked about that back in the first lecture when cells become unresponsive to certain hormones. So here, because of poor diet, your cells become resistant to insulin. Even though insulin is produced, the cells do not respond. So in both cases, the cells are not being stimulated to uptake glucose. Type 1, it's because there's no insulin there. Type 2, it's because the cells are not responding to it. So now just kind of to sum everything up, we've talked about type 1 diabetes mellitus, type 2 diabetes mellitus. We've talked about steroid diabetes. We've talked about nephrogenic diabetes insipidus and neurogenic diabetes insipidus. That's a lot of diabetes, and that's not even all of them. We haven't talked about gestational diabetes, which is common among pregnant women. We won't talk about that. You're not responsible for knowing it, but that's just to kind of give you an idea of there's a lot of different types of diabetes. Also, we have something called amylin. Amylin, this is a peptide hormone. Its stimulus is the same as insulin. It's inhibited the same as insulin, but it functions to reduce spikes of blood glucose by slowing stomach emptying. Now, here it modulates secretion of gastric enzymes and other substances by the stomach. It inhibits glucagon secretion, which we'll talk about glucagon here in just a moment. And it stimulates the sensation of satiety. This is the feeling of being full. Moving on to the alpha cells. Alpha cells produce glucagon. Glucagon is another amino acid-based hormone. Its stimulus is decreased blood glucose, sympathetic nervous system, and increased blood amino acids. This is almost the exact opposite of insulin. It's inhibited by rises in blood glucose. It's inhibited by insulin. It's inhibited by growth hormone and by amylin. Its function, there's several, again, just like we saw with insulin. The functions of glucagon include glycogenolysis. Well, earlier with insulin, we talked about glycogenesis, taking a bunch of glucose, stringing them together to make glycogen. Well, glycogenolysis is exactly the opposite. It's taking glycogen and cutting it into little pieces, releasing glucose into the blood for your body to use. Also, gluconeogenesis. We mentioned that with cortisol. Gluconeogenesis, glucose from fat and protein. We're getting carbohydrates from non-carbohydrate sources. And finally, glucose release from the liver. Now, here, once that glycogen is broken down, we need that glucose to spill out into the blood. So all of these things will lead to a rise in blood glucose. Glycogen and insulin are constantly working against each other. And that's what we see in this diagram. Here on the left, we see that classic negative feedback loop. When blood glucose rises, the pancreas releases insulin, stimulates different tissues to uptake glucose. Blood glucose levels fall. Once they get too low, then the pancreas releases glucagon, which stimulates the liver to break down glycogen and release it, so our blood glucose levels rise, and we're constantly going back and forth between these two. Over here is kind of a diagram of what happens at the cells. Up at the top, this is what insulin does. Causes blood glucose to move that glucose into the cell. The cells, at the liver at least, will take that excess glucose, string it together to make glycogen. That's glycogenesis. When blood glucose levels fall, glucagon causes glycogenolysis. The glycogen is broken down into glucose. Also, gluconeogenesis. Fats and proteins, non-carbohydrate sources, are converted to glucose, and that glucose is released into the blood, raising your blood glucose levels. So, what is a disorder of glucagon? Hyposecretion of glucagon causes hypoglycemia. This is what I was referring to a moment ago with insulin when I said make a note. Both of these result in hypoglycemia, low blood sugar. In the case of insulin, hypersecretion causes hypoglycemia. In the case of glucagon, hyposecretion causes hypoglycemia. Both too much insulin or not enough glucagon will cause low blood sugar. And finally, the delta cells of the islets of Langerhans, they can release GHIH, growth hormone inhibiting hormone, somatostatin. This we're not as comfortable with saying exactly what the stimulus is. We think that it's the same as insulin. It's inhibited, we think, the same as insulin. Its function, it works hand in hand with amylin from the beta cells to limit secretion of stomach acid. So those are all of the hormones and glands of the endocrine system that we will talk about. But practically every tissue in your body will produce hormones at some point. And we're not going to go through all of them. There are some good charts later in your chapter. Let's see, towards the back of your chapter, on page 646, 647, 645, there are several charts of several different tissues in your body that produce various hormones. First, let's talk about the pineal gland. The pineal gland is a small gland in your brain. It produces melatonin. Melatonin at night, when the lights get dim, that stimulates the release of melatonin, so melatonin rises at nighttime. It diminishes in the daytime, so when there's bright light, melatonin stops being released. Melatonin is responsible for our circadian rhythm. It causes drowsiness during daylight as levels fall. It causes wakefulness. It's also important for antioxidant production. It's also a regulator of mood. This explains why, like, if you've worked third shift for any length of time, often you'll be a little less cheerful. And that's because it kind of interacts with your ability to be on a normal sleep schedule, and you can kind of get a little grumpy. Now, also, this can possibly explain seasonal affective disorder, SAD. During the winter months, daylight is not as long and nights are much longer. So this can really affect melatonin in some people, and they get a depression. It's sometimes called seasonal depression. Next, adipose tissue, which is just fat. Adipose tissue produces something called leptin. Leptin decreases appetite, which kind of makes sense, because if you have more fat, then you will have more leptin, and you'll have lower appetite because your body already has a large energy reserve. Your stomach makes hormones. One of those is ghrelin. Ghrelin is released when fasting. So when it's been a while since you've eaten. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean fasting, for days or weeks on end. This is just when it's been a while since you've eaten and your stomach is empty, then ghrelin is released. And this increases appetite. When you feel hungry, that is the effect of ghrelin. The atria of the heart. We've already mentioned that they release ANP. We've talked about that since cardio. Atrial natriuretic peptide, ANP, decreases blood pressure. It does this by decreasing sodium reabsorption. It does this by vasodilation. We talked about how at the kidneys it washes away that osmotic gradient in the medulla. The kidneys, they release EPO, erythropoietin. Again, we've talked about that way back. That might have been even on the first day of class. Erythropoietin responds to low oxygen. When your blood oxygen drops, your kidneys release erythropoietin. Erythropoietin causes erythropoiesis. Your red bone marrow starts to make more erythrocytes. Erythrocytes spill out, and now we have better ability to carry blood. Better ability to carry oxygen in our blood. The thymus. Briefly, the thymus was talked about in the lymph system, and also it's one of the items you need to know on the fetal pig. The thymus releases several hormones: thymosin, thymopoietin, thymulin. These things work to cause the T cells to develop. Remember, T lymphocytes, after they're made in the red bone marrow, they travel to the thymus where they develop. These hormones help guide that. It also causes lymphoid organ development. When your other organs in your lymph system are developing, it's guided by these hormones. Also, some aspects of your immune response are guided by these hormones. When your lymphocytes are dividing as part of your immune response, these hormones are thought to play a role in that.
Okay, so that is the end of this lecture. That is the end of this chapter. That is the end of material for Bio 139. But as I said in the beginning of this lecture, there are a lot of exams coming up. We have exam 3 in lab. We have exam 4 in lecture. And we have the final exam, all one right after another. So it is not time to back off. You are just moments away from being able to finally put your feet up and take a breather, but you're not there yet. So please don't back off just yet. But the good news is that is the end of material for Bio 139. You've reached the end except for the exams. Now, while this is in an online format, I have not gotten to meet most of you. And it breaks my heart because I love standing up in front of the classroom and getting to know my students and interact with my students. And that's difficult in an online class. But all of that said, I want you to take this away. If you are done hearing my voice and you never want to interact with me again, you don't have to. But from my perspective, I don't stop being your instructor when the class ends. I stop being your instructor when you want me to stop being your instructor. I hope that you are comfortable enough in the future, even after you are done with this class, to, when you have a question, keep my information. Reach out, and I am more than happy to help for as long as you would like me to help. You're going to move past the point where I'm able to help. When you move deep into your programs, that's not where my expertise lies. So there's a good chance that if you ask me a question, I might not be able to help you, but that doesn't mean I'm not going to try. I will do what I can to help you. But also, as you move on in your careers or in your clinicals, if you have something that you think, hey, I bet Scott would like to hear that, I can guarantee you Scott would like to hear that. I love hearing about my students' experiences. If you come across something that is just really strange and you think, man, that would have been a good case study, let me know and I will make it into a case study for future students. I absolutely love to talk about this stuff, and as long as you want to talk about this stuff with me, I'm going to be here to talk about this stuff. All right, so like I said, you've reached the end. I want you to go out there and take these exams and just absolutely destroy them. I want all of you guys to get A's in this class. Whether that's possible, I don't know, but that's what I want. I want you guys to just excel. So, it has been absolutely my honor to get to teach you all this semester, and I hope I hear from you in the future. Thanks so much.